Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's discussion. We're excited to host Jason Hundley, founder and CEO of Crossbow Systems, revolutionizing how the United States builds rocket propulsion. Crossbow is leading the way in solid rocket motors, using modular and mobile manufacturing to make rocket production faster, more flexible, and more resilient. In the past, Jason, you bring experience from Northrop, the Marine Corps, and running a company for over 15 years until we see that you started Crossbow. It's an incredible journey. I'd like to just jump into things with getting to know you. I want to hear the background and the founding story of how Crossbow came to be.
All right. Let's see. The here's the I'll give it the 60-second version. Um, so Crossbow originally was founded, we were commercializing a small launch technology. That was out of Sandia National Labs and Air Force Base Kirtland. So before the company was formed, we actually won the rights to commercialize a solid propulsion rocket vehicle that went to orbit. That was called the Super Stripey program. So as we formed the company, we had various agreements put in place with both U.S. propulsion providers at the time, ATK and Aerojet Rocketdyne. Those were the companies at the time before the bigs bought them. So we were trying to make a business case close for this particular launch vehicle. And so we had a $15 million price point that would close a business case, and the propulsion was going to cost 11.5 to 12 million of that business case. So that meant we had to do the payload integration, the launch services, the range, the rest of the vehicle, the avionics software and everything else for basically $3.5 million just to break even. And so we kind of thought to ourselves, okay, this is painful. So we did a whole bunch of revisions on that thesis. We got some of the cost downs, but that kind of really led me into the sort of the Comcast duopolistic model that was around about a decade ago. So when we formed Crossbow, one of the conclusions we came early on was if we were going to make the launch side of systems work, that we were going to have to basically control our own destiny on the propulsion side. That led to our core technology, which with our brilliant engineering minds, we immediately made it an acronym and we called it Additive Manufacturing Solid Propellant, and we acronized that to AMSP. That started out with a DARPA SBIR phase one in 2018, and we've been sort of off to the races ever since. And really, the thesis of that AMSP technology was three things. One, reduce the cost and footprint of manufacturing solid propellant for rocket propulsion and other technology, other applications. The second was make a technology that was inherently safer than the existing technology, because that's a big deal in the solid propellant world, which is very, very close to the explosive and the warhead and, that community type of systems. And then the third was using, today's manufacturing technologies. Could we unlock performance chemistries and things that were never before available because everything was just a giant, throw it into a giant mix bowl and out comes one product. And so that was the thesis. We started the technology, and literally this week our first production system is turning on right now. So it is capacity that is turning on literally this week. I'm still waiting on my phone from pictures where we're going to be starting to flow the simulant through the system. They owe me pictures today at some point.
Wow, it's incredible. How would you describe a solid rocket motor to someone who doesn't exactly understand what it is and what the purpose of it is, how it's useful in comparison to, liquid fuel motors?
Yeah. So, so a lot of probably this investor community is probably familiar with like SpaceX, The liquid technology, with like Firefly and other public companies. The basics, the way that I try to describe these things is liquid propulsion is basically your Prius type of system to get to orbit. It is more efficient, um, but so when fuel efficiency is of a premium, you want liquid propulsion because that's what can get you out of the Earth's gravity well, which is why you see most launch vehicles that go to orbit use liquid propulsion. Solid rocket motors are essentially your ATVs. All right. So you take your Polaris off-roader, does high G maneuvers. You can, launch it at 20 Gs, 25 Gs. You can store it. It turns on in an instant. It's just rough handling, capable through wartime environments and everything else. And so basically, a lot of people like to go, oh, well, why don't we just use a liquid? Have you ever, and I say, have you ever seen a Prius go off-road? They don't do that very successfully. And so that's kind of how those two propulsion domains work. When you need something that turns on in an instant, super simple, go with a solid. When you want gas efficiency, or in the rocket world, we call it ISP, you go with a liquid.
Got it. Okay. And why emphasize on being a non-traditional defense company? What does that mean to your culture and decision making?
So, in the world of, I will just call it the space and defense community, having a non-traditional approach means that you're willing to take on a lot more risk. It also means that you are not classed, literally the government will class you as a traditional, provider if, you own these programs of records. So companies that basically turn, and own the major program of records are an actual traditional defense prime. A non-traditional defense prime is somebody that is coming in with a different business model and or a different approach, but they may not have all the government accounting systems and all those type of things put into place. And so there's a bunch of type of contracts that are currently out there that make it difficult for non-traditionals. But that non-traditional mindset means, you with a lot of our development projects that are firm fixed price, you are taking on the risk on the company when something does not go wrong. And most traditional companies do not do firm fixed price development. And so those type of mindsets, I would call it like the appetite for risk is much greater in a non-traditional than a traditional.
Got it. And could you tell us a little bit about the rocket family that you have at Crossbow? Like, how many rockets are they? How big are they? What do they scale to, and what are they really capable?
So at our company currently, we've got about 14 development programs going on right now. So that means we've got 14 various applications between launch, hypersonics, mid-size, tactical, rocket assisted takeoff. Like it spans the gamut from literally a rocket motor that's about this, slightly bigger than my iPhone, holds about 15 pounds of propellant used to pop UAVs up into just get them up into the atmosphere, all the way to basically we've got our largest motor is about 25 feet long, 34 and a half inch in diameter, and holds about 10,000 pounds of propellant. That is a second source for the Army long range hypersonic weapon and the conventional prompt strike. And so that system, there's two of them. There's the first stage, and then there's the second stage. When you stack those two onto each other, that's essentially propels 1,000-pound hypersonic glide vehicle to like Mach 10, Mach 15. So we
Wow.
do the gamut in between. So it's like uh, we've got a whole family tree of vehicles, and we've built the design, development, and the skills to take on all those different development programs.
Uh,
Are
and
all those, is that product portfolio depth? Is that just coming from a very innovative culture at Crossbow? Or is that coming from, more government demand or more customer demand, where customers now are looking at Crossbow for more solutions in hypersonics, or was this kind of the plan you set out at the beginning in 2018?
Um, so what we found very quickly, and this was a little bit after 2018, was that there was like three main factors that occurred at once. Sort of with the atrophy of the existing solid rocket motor industrial base, new programs in the hypersonics area and the nuclear modernization era really challenged the existing industrial base to try to keep up with these new programs.
Okay.
Then the third thing was the Ukraine conflict in 2022. Essentially, for lack of a better term, sort of every assumption that we built up from the end of the Cold War on what was needed for a stockpile was shown to be woefully insufficient. The way I was describing this, and I'm going to use a four-letter term, we had very, very shitty assumptions of what you need for a stockpile. When you are off by an order of magnitude in the engineering world, your estimating methodology is usually determined to be shit. And we have continually seen that even when we reforecast, we clearly continue to underestimate the need for that in the tactical and in the medium and strategic realms.
My wife, Jason, the other day told me that like it's a positive thing for management to use an expletive because it shows they're sincere or passionate. So I think you're doing a hell of a job.
I see. Well, occasionally I will say this. I slip into my Marine Corps NCO terminology, and that does occur occasionally.
How much do you think we're in sort of like a Goldilocks scenario type environment for a lot of new companies starting defense versus like this is like a much bigger tale and this is kind of where the world is going to go for decades? How would you describe Crossbow or some of the companies as being like more anti-fragile and durable?
So, I mean, what the world has taught us in the last 3 years is that if you do not have the internal capability for air defense against, large UAVs, and incoming missiles, you are extremely vulnerable in today's world. Every European country is starting to learn that lesson. Every Middle Eastern country is starting to learn that lesson. And every Pacific Asian country is starting to learn that lesson. So there is, in this domain at least, we are in currently a market of unlimited demand and very little new supply.
Okay.
And we are the result of that, I believe, is also creating the appetite, for fresh idea and fresh approaches because the demand is so severe and so acute and so necessary at this moment.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, going off of that, you talked about it briefly of just we always hear about the bottleneck in the United States when it comes to systems like this, rockets, defense tech for our military. I want to get your take on how did we get here, and what role does a company like Crossbow play in revitalizing that?
Oof. I think it's actually, unfortunately, I believe it's a systemic issue we do have as Americans. If I use a runner's analogy, it feels like here in the US we suck at running, with a lead, and we do much better when we feel like we've got to catch up and we close. So we've got a great closing capability, but we do not necessarily do great, running with a lead when we look at the world, power demographics, or look at things like there's great analogies from every defense leader. It's like Donald Rumsfeld was like, hey, we're thoroughly equipped to fight the last war. And, and so you look, we learn all our lessons and we go, well, let's not repeat that again. But oftentimes, your adversaries are just as smart as you are and are going to look to exploit, what you've built up. And that's kind of, I just, it feels endemic across that. What that does allow is when those times of needs arise, if you go look at what we did with our industrial capacity in World War II, I mean, we turned auto factories into bomber factories overnight. We know how to, at least at the base level, pivot the industrial base. And we're seeing that conversation going now. And I think it's incumbent on, companies like us with new technologies, to show that, hey, you know what, you don't have to just repeat how you built things 70 years ago. We've got what we believe is a much more scalable mousetrap that can enable a lot of gap correction in this industrial base.
You've described your approach as the rocket factory in a box. Can you talk about what that means operationally and how it changes capital efficiency compared to legacy defense primes?
Yeah. Yeah. So the major systems that we use, typically the CapEx for meaningful capacity starts with $1 billion, and you've got thousands of acres of land, and you buy these, gigantic mix bowls that are, 600 gallons, 1,000 gallons. They're long lead items. They take, they're heavy, literally heavy. They're, reinforced steel walls, vacuum jacketed. They require a lot of power, so they're very, very large pieces of infrastructure. Our system turns that thesis on its head. We do the same level of throughput as these gigantic bowls, but think of it as like we're turning on a faucet and it just sort of continually runs. And so we start with chemicals on one side and we just continually feed it through our system. And so basically what that allows you to do is scale down the physical size of the equipment. It also allows you to monitor things in situ, and it really allows you to shove it into 20-foot shipping containers. And so we were able to take our energetics manufacturing technology. In fact, it's working now in Texas. We deployed it, and basically it can be set up within 10 business days anywhere in the world. And so basically, if you have a weather cover, if you want to jumpstart your air defense industry, if you want to basically tackle your missile munition crisis, in a resilient fashion, as opposed to like one major factory that if it goes online, you lose half your capacity. These are like little distributed nodes, so it's just like basically rack servers as opposed to gigantic, supercomputers. And so we believe that technology is a game changer for many countries that are now trying to stand up an industrial base indigenous technology.
Jason, could you talk a little bit about, we're hearing quite a bit about Europe rearming itself and how that is a new tailwind for companies in your area?
Yeah. So the European countries are definitely beefing up their industrial base as quickly as they can. There is an acute need for air defense system all over the place. And so we have ongoing conversations happening with multiple European companies, mainly about how we can co-locate production capacity, because that's another feature of today's world. We're not necessarily, a lot of countries are not looking at the U.S. as, the infinite source of supply, and they want to build up a lot of indigenous type capabilities. Unfortunately, with our strategic agreement, with Lockheed Martin, they've got programs and a lot of things called offsets. And so we're in a sort of a whole series of conversations on different countries, how we could footprint, how we can sort of help them build up their own missile munition enterprise with our technology as sort of an enabler. So it's going to be for us, sort of picking the first right country, to sort of footprint in and get our European roots underneath us. At the same time, we're also having these conversations with Middle Eastern countries and with Indo-Pacific countries as well. So Crossbow, I expect to have an international presence in multiple locations probably within the next 12 months.
Is that something in 2018, you would have imagined that the opportunity in Europe in 2018 would have been something that Crossbow was well positioned for going after?
That was not on our radar in
Okay.
2018. Our big focus in 2018 was on the hypersonic side of things, and looking at our launch in hypersonics. I will say this definitely is a large emergence since the Ukrainian conflict in 2022.
Okay. Thank you.
Uh, just looking at this ecosystem, the launch of propulsion, this landscape's just becoming more fragmented. How does Crossbow fit into this evolving ecosystem?
So, for us, I will say, uh, I call it we're we are very technically depth proficient, where we can converse with folks, from an integrated launch service or, a tip to tail product standpoint, where we're watching a lot of other companies come into the marketplace and they're just sort of learning and feeling their way around. Um, I believe there are going to be a whole bunch of companies that come in, and it's very simple to make a one-off, rocket motor or demonstrator vehicle. Like, I mean, that is 1%, level, achievement, to unlock. It is a completely different level of achievement to unlock, serious capacity and to be able to make 1,000 of something. And so for those companies that are kind of new technology and new idea in the onesie twosie phase, if they do not have clear line of sight on how they're going to make 1,000 of them, and they don't have the processes in place to make 1,000 of them, my guess is just like other booms and contractions, sort of like in the small launch industry, 10, 15 years ago, you're going to see a lot of players probably go by the wayside because their scaling thesis just did not prove effective.
Got it. Yeah, and looking at this industry, you don't see too many solid rocket motors in this, and we're seeing it grow quite a bit now, this power vacuum. Um, in terms of capability, uh, the demand we're seeing is this. I actually see a question here from the audience, and I welcome anyone who's attending to ask questions. But is this strictly DoD and Gov or DOW and Gov, or is it starting to move more towards commercial?
So, highly dependent on the definition of commercial. Um, a lot of our customers, as a lower tier level provider, there's folks like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, there's Rheinmetall, there's, MHI, Japan. There's a whole bunch of companies that want solid rocket motors for their applications, largely in the defense community. There are very much new niches, and there's always been niches of solid rocket motors in space. Sample return was usually a solid propulsion element. Deorbit motors are another area where we've seen interest for solid rocket motor technologies. Space-based interceptor is another one where you probably see a lot of solid rocket motor technology in space. Boosters, if you go look at the United Launch Alliance vehicle or the Space Launch System, they use solid rocket motors as boosters, as sort of you strap on a pretty big thrust bucket for, very little change in the larger vehicle context. And so there's always been, where it made sense, you could use, solid rocket propulsion, but the majority of the use of it is in defense type of applications. Except there's one commercial application that I think if it doesn't matter if anybody has driven in a vehicle today, you have probably encountered and been surrounded by about a half a dozen solid rocket motors, which is the largest commercial market for solid rocket motor propulsion, and that's the airbag industry. The exact site chemistries, everything that we use in our SRMs, also are in little gas charges for airbags.
Yeah, I remember learning about that when I toured the facility in Texas. Found it quite interesting. I'm curious what other unique, what else is unique about the engineering process or designs that might surprise people, especially with crossbow being so innovative.
Yeah, there's other applications like ejection seats in aircraft. There's solid rocket motor propelled safety systems on aircraft. The gas generators typically are solid rocket motor generators that pop open all the slides off of aircraft. And so those type of systems are pretty interesting. And then the same type of systems, the construction industry, same type of technologies using, to manufacture shape charges and those things in the construction industry uses various types of energetics, which are very akin to the type of energetics that you use in solid rocket motors.
Got it.
Jason, we got a question through email, not in the chat, and they're just asking about M&A in space and defense tech broadly. They're just, they've seen companies now doing acquisitions in space tech, and then Anduril has been very active with acquisitions. How does M&A fit into solid rocket motors or the hypersonic area over the long term?
So we've done one M&A, and it was based on a thesis of wanting to vertically integrate our capabilities. Anduril looks like they do M&As based on they want to expand their portfolio, and so they have a horizontal M&A strategy where they want to penetrate or take over new markets, and so they make M&As decisions based on that type of deal. For Crossbow, we look at it as, we want to be best in class where we're at and where our expertise lends itself, to the most. So basically, we view ourselves as very technically deep in one area that we believe has strong tailwinds for the next decade. And we will look at M&As that help us sort of, match that thesis in that type of industrial-based space.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here about long-haul logistics. Space rock companies with liquid engines argue that the lack of flexibility to launch from distance international sites because of solid fuel technically being prone to explosions and are difficult to transport. Could you comment on that question?
So long haul logistics. So basically, the way that I kind of view it is the way liquids are, they're fantastic at a fixed base location where you have a tremendous amount of logistics surrounding them. The cryogenic fuels that got to be maintained and topped off within minutes of launch, the kerosene farms, the nitrous, the gas pressurization farms, the amount of helium. You need about 7 different pressurants and gases and chemicals to just get one liquid rocket to launch. With a solid, I need a spark. And so the actual logistics of just transporting solids is pretty well understood. The military hauls them around a lot. You got to pay attention to the transportation loads. Typically, the ones that are more prone to going higher order are the much older ones that are about 40 or 50 years old. And that propellant inside is probably broken down in some way where then it's, where it was great to transport for 40 years, it's probably not great to start transporting it now. Those are when we start to see solids not work in the logistics. And so if you want, very austere location, very austere launch, my professional opinion is you can't really beat a solid. If you're trying to basically make a liquid work, you could make a liquid, and we do have liquid stages on some of the strategic systems, but we typically have them in silos, and you typically have to, maintain the liquid systems at a much more frequent rate than a solid.
Yeah. And as I'm seeing this, the space and defense, they're converging fast. How do you see the boundary shifting over the next 5 years?
Personally and professionally, I think really the commercial space revolution was the first defense tech revolution. Most of the customer, for the imagery, most of the customers for the small satellites and the disaggregated architectures weren't commercial applications. They were selling to the intelligence community and the defense community. I mean, I knew lots of friends, that started satellite companies, and they were largely, if it wasn't tourism driven, it had a defense thesis drive to it. So I think really it is an investor comfort where we're now allowed to basically talk about defense tech as pure defense tech, as opposed to putting on the guise of commercial space, which really was about, most of the revenue was actually powered by, defense technology needs.
Yeah. And sorry, some other questions are coming in. But as you were saying that they sort of come over and, defense and space, they're kind of their own thing now almost, and sort of not in the way. Um, I'm curious of what Crossbow has with what it's capable of with missions and uh, orbital applications, reverse tactical applications, and how you see that evolving, not just with Crossbow, but maybe other industries as well, that are adjacent to propulsion.
Yeah, I mean, so where I see long term, taking a lot of what we call messy operations and moving them, out into space. I mean, there's you can't you can't pollute the oceans in space. There's no oceans. It's hard to pollute the atmosphere when you're doing stuff in space. And so I think what we're going to end up seeing, hopefully in a relatively short order, are really cool industrial capacities, looking at, mining on the moon, or asteroids, getting those industrial operations working in space. All of those same industrial operations are likely going to need energetics technologies like what Crossbow provides, because it's, very, very easy and portable to transport those in the atmospheres. Other things that we are seeing, with traffic management and many more satellites, is probably the need for, think of it as like, standardized sort of like seat belts on cars. There'll probably be some sort of deorbit level system that starts going on, certain classes of satellites that aren't part of the main fuel source, which you just bolt it onto the side, and its sole purpose is to deorbit that vehicle safely and in a controlled manner, so that we're not creating what I would call like a, sort of high speed debris field in these medium low Earth orbits. And all those are, perfect examples of using, solid rocket motor level technologies.
Yeah.
Are you
And
seeing a lot of companies move into solid rocket motors, Jason? Are you seeing a lot of companies try and pivot into this area? And how do you think about new entrants that are coming into solid rocket motors? It seems to be an area where Crossbow and a few companies are dominating. Is there a future where there's a lot more companies doing solid rocket motors? Is that dynamic not make sense? What does the future look like for the competitive landscape for this area?
So back in the 80s, in the early 90s, before the end of the Cold War, there was about 6 solid rocket motor level propulsion houses in the US. That's what the industrial base had, as an ability to sustain. And so,
Who are those six companies?
oh my gosh, some of those were names that, Hercules,
Hercules.
Thiokol,
Okay.
Alliant, they merged into companies called ATK,
Right. Okay.
you
Yeah.
know, and then basically from my, it kind of got down to the one and a half suppliers where the ATK and still is, from a, business base, provides about 75% of the solid rocket motors in the US. Aerojet Rocketdyne provides about 20%. And then there's international companies like Nammo, they have some small facilities. And there's some specific companies like Collins, there's some very niche application companies that kind of pick up that 5% market.
Okay.
Um, that's our focus. I am much less focused on companies pivoting into the market space
Okay.
because they have 0% market share. And so we're focused on working with the customers that we do have, getting our programs online and becoming sort of the third player in that market space that's US based. Um, and so, I will say if the market can support it, the pool is fantastic. Jump on
Yeah.
in,
Okay.
but jump in with adult level recognition of the type of compliance and the type of regulatory environment you're getting into.
Okay.
This is not to be taken lightly. This is one of the most heavily regulated industries for a reason, because, if people saw reports out of Tennessee, when something does go wrong, it can go wrong very, very higher order very quickly.
Okay. In 2018, you were starting Crossbow. What is it like in 2025? Do you feel like you're still kind of like a startup and a stealth company, or does it feel like now, at the size of the company, the successes you've had, does it feel very different at the company? And um, how do you fight against the success? I mean, like you want to be like the one with the chip on the shoulder and fighting every day. Is that still Crossbow's culture and still who you are? Is it changing quite a bit as you found such great success for the last, especially last year or so?
So that's an internal debate already going on inside the company. I mean, we've
Okay.
doubled in size year after year,
Yeah.
since 2020. We're over 350 people.
Wow.
We've got production contracts we have to deliver on, and I've got literally I walk around to I fly into one of our sites and I'm introducing myself to new employees all the time.
Yeah.
And so that you cannot say that doesn't change the culture.
Right.
Um, it does, compared to, having a half a dozen folks and, in some partnerships with universities. So, but that was the intent of the company all along.
Okay.
And so it wasn't as if, we hired a bunch of employees and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, one day we're going to go get into this.
Yeah.
That's been our business plan all along. And so the people that have joined along, have helped shaped and get us to where we're at. And everybody, I think, is fairly clear at where we're at, from a business plan and a maturity standpoint. I don't believe, pretty soon, we're modeling next year, we should be at some point, we could be EBITDA positive, just based off the revenue traction and the customer traction we've gained. And so, yeah, it's always been a marker for me, kind of, compared to, say, startup mode to, real mode. We're going to be over, you know, well over 100 million in revenue this year. So that does not feel like we're in a, quote unquote startup situation,
Right.
uh, from that aspect.
Okay, great. Aiden, we have a couple questions in the chat. You want to handle those? Great,
Yeah.
great question from Tracy. I don't know if you see it.
Question is, have any of the has any of your supply chain or raw material sourcing partners been impacted by tariffs?
Yes, especially in the construction side of my site. So we've actually tried to model some things in there, but yeah, we found some raw materials, building supplies, some of these things, overnight shot up 20%. and then they come back down, it's like, so it's a very, I will say, unpredictable element at some of the base constituent levels. So it really hits us probably about the, fifth or sixth level of component supply because, some of these things, they're just, overseas suppliers, feeding into the US base. We don't necessarily manufacture everything here. So those type of lower level items, I've been surprised at how quickly, some of my construction costs jumped up like 20% on a building.
Wow. Um, yeah, and when you're talking about this with, your manufacturing capabilities, the speed that you have to get these out here and, the intellectual property you have, I'm curious, what's your defensibility most rooted in? It seems like you have a good chunk of the market share and, a lot of key things are keeping you there. But what have you found to be probably the strongest point of keeping Crossbow on top?
So one thing unique about our system is since it's multi-staged, it's like, broken up into bays and it's not just one big item and a massive piece of infrastructure. It allows for upgradability so we can continually add new features onto the manufacturing system, just like we can add a new solid rocket motor program. And so the technology is going to continue to evolve. It's like, it will be our generation zero system was based off of, our R&D system in New Mexico. And once we get it to turn out product in the next couple months here, it technically will be obsolete because we'll already be working on the new features in our R&D system, and we're going to be continually doing that feedback loop. And so the way you stay on top of things is to realize that the world is not static, even in hardware anymore. Your hardware development, your manufacturing development, it never stops. And if you're not continually improving that base infrastructure along with your products, you are going to get left behind. And so that is a thesis that we're building into the DNA of the company, and that we're going to be talking and literally had DoD folks out last week and tried to explain to them the way that we regulate these sites, from an approval standpoint. We're going to be challenging them because, what they like to do is they like to bless a site for the next 20 years. And so people say, don't touch. And we're going to continually upgrade our systems, which is going to be a different type of framework from a regulatory standpoint.
Hmm. Going off of that, I'm curious what some of the other misconceptions are that investors or government partners often have with Crossbow and the business model you have and the market you're addressing.
Um, I will say sometimes we get it's amazing, I will just say, because specifically in the government and in the industrial base, uh, each sector are like little silos. Rarely do the missile guys talk to the space launch people. Those boundaries don't cross over that well. We've infused that cultural fusion, in our company. And so we're trying to cross-pollinate those ideas, but working with the DoD folks, I mean, you find guys that basically just work two missile programs their entire lives. And SpaceX is still this fantasy thing that has nothing to do with defense tech. And so bridging those conversations, especially with the government folks, it almost feels like you're like trying to explain the 21st century, of multi sectors of technology improvement and how we're bringing that into this niche. And, and don't be shocked at how fast that innovation occurs. That's the one thing that continually even surprises me is the rate of innovation of what you can do in this sector of the industrial base is pretty impressive because it really hasn't been innovated in so long.
Gotcha. And as we see this innovation changes, I'm wondering what it's been like with hiring talent and getting the right team in place, with us seeing more and more people going into aerospace and to universities and studying that, and people working at other space and defense companies. Has it become a lot easier to find good talent, or has the good talent all kind of magneted towards, certain companies, and the high level talent might be hard to obtain? What's it like right now in terms of, getting all those right people?
Um, my take on this is a lot of the talent that we are bringing into the company now is typically word of mouth. Um, and 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 I've been not terribly surprised. If you put, for lack of better terms, if you put a good company together with a decent philosophy and you treat people like adults and you expect them to act like adults, the talent attracts to those type of high performing organizations. There's certain high performers that are attracted to, oh, well, I'm going to go work here because that's where you got to go make that resume remark, and then I'm going to go do my startup or whatever. We're also trying to create a culture in the company, but this is uh, at the end of the day, one of the things that I'd like to hear about Crossbow, that's the best place I ever worked. They treated the people right. They were transparent, honest, in their objectives. They accomplished, they did what they were saying they were going to do. And, I've got guys that have been in the industry 40 or 50 years that literally, they'll come up and say, this is the most fun I've ever had within my 50 years of the industry. And that type of stuff in this industrial base, that word does kind of get around. And so we've not really had huge challenges on attracting talent.
That's
Got it.
great. That's amazing.
Very
Jason,
nice.
could you talk a little bit about Texas and New Mexico? A lot of what I think folks on this call are investing into is like Southern California and like these really specific areas. But y'all are in New Mexico and Texas and doing extraordinarily well. You're one of the first companies, I think, in Austin that I can remember. So could you just talk about being based in those areas or the strength of the startup scene in New Mexico and Texas?
Yeah, I mean, so we're headquartered in New Mexico, and I got engineers in Albuquerque, and then we have our R&D center in Socorro. And it's at a facility, we've been there for 5 or 6 years, and New Mexico has been tremendous in terms of its support, for the company. And when we went and looked at where we wanted to be from a production thesis, we did a site selection of like 15 locations in 7 states. And really that area that we were at, between Austin and San Antonio looked like it provided one really ease of attracting talent because of the universities. Texas A&M is not too far. We got Texas University, Texas State, three large universities to attract young folks. The cost of living, wasn't like Austin cost of living. We're down in the Luling area, so that San Marcos area is still affordable for younger talent to work there. And then Texas, in terms of just getting, well, pardon my French, getting shit done, it's very, very simple if you have the community behind you. And
Okay.
so the city of Luling is fantastic. We have regular conversations with them. San Marcos and Caldwell County are fantastic, to work with. And so to be able to just get things done and not have what I would call like regulatory hurdles, which you would have in California if you tried to put this infrastructure in place. We'd probably still be not even turning dirt in California if we were, tried to do a greenfield site. And that's just, because of the environmental regulations that you have to go through with the type of industry we're in.
Okay.
Whereas Texas seems, a little bit more, it's got the oil fields and stuff. It knows how to deal with, heavy chemical industries a bit better.
Okay. Great. Aiden, I think we have a few minutes left. We'll have the chat open if anyone has any last second questions here, and then we'll let Jason get back to running crossbow.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I have a quick fire question or two that won't take too long. One of them I was curious about is what's an early decision that really set the tone for Crossbow and the way it operates today?
So, I mean, we made very early on, we were going to treat this as a mature business. We were not in this for egos. We were in this to, really, really uh, grow a actual well-run mature business. So a decision early on we made, this is about 4 years ago, about 2021. We were having, scaling issues on our technology. It was not, scaling as fast as we would like. And so we made a decision early on that we set up a partnership with Indian Head, and then we talked with our launch customer and said, well, okay, originally we were going to have this technology on this launch, but we made a business decision to pivot them, still launch our vehicle and get, what our customer needed using traditional technology, but it allowed us a huge amount of schedule relief and, time relief and risk relief, allowing our technology to mature. And so we've always kind of had that, business decision approach, of what makes sense for the customer as opposed to, oh, well, we have to disrupt everything. And if we don't disrupt everything, we're not proving out the, startup ethos. And so I think that has allowed us, to engage with, new startup level companies, great, but also allows us to work with some of the traditional companies as well, because it's like they have their ways of doing business, and we're straddling that middle ground, but we're doing it from a thoughtful business decision way.
I love that. Okay. Well, as we're wrapping up on time, Jason, really appreciate you joining and pulling back from all the work you're doing at Crossbow and being able to chat with us and our audience. It's really been a pleasure, and I'm really excited to see Crossbow in the near future.
No, and I appreciate you guys, and serious, you know, I will, and this is for, all the folks that are on the line. Uh, in terms of folks that dig in, and I mean dig in and try to understand this sector of an industrial base, uh, Balerion has shown themselves to be very, very acutely aware of the companies, the trends, and the features. And that is something I've always liked working with you guys. You know, I will say you probably hold the record for the number of investor tours through our facility.
It's a fun tour.
It's been really
Yeah,
fun.
yeah, yeah. Now they're a lot less fun because actually now that it's switching to operational, we can only do drive-by tours on most of
Yeah.
this now. So, but
It,
but but seriously, it's like the level of acumen that you guys bring to this sector and industrial base have been totally appreciated because it's like you've done a remarkable job of I will say sifting through a lot of chaff to find the actual kernels of the companies to invest in this space.
yeah, it's been an honor to work with you and Maureen and be connected to Crossbow. So thanks so much for the kind words. Thanks so much for your time today. I know there's a lot of people who wanted to be on this call today, so really appreciate it. Have a wonderful day. Thanks, everyone.
All
Bye.
right. Thank you.
Take care.